Japan is stepping into this phase already off balance. Ever since the energy shock 3 years ago, momentum has faded, expenses have climbed, and public confidence has steadily weakened. Political continuity didn't survive the strain. Kishida exited, Ishiba followed, and the current prime minister took office with almost no tolerance for missteps. That fragile backdrop made what came next even more consequential. Remarks related to Taiwan, delivered by Takichi, landed directly on one of the most sensitive fault lines in international politics. Beijing did not treat the comments as casual rhetoric or a diplomatic slip. It reacted decisively. Instead of symbolic gestures, China chose an economic counterstrike designed to hurt where it matters most. Wide-ranging export restrictions were introduced, aimed squarely at sectors that form the backbone of Japan's industrial system, and the impact began unfolding almost immediately. For China, Taiwan is not a negotiable topic or a matter of tone. It is central to national sovereignty, security strategy, and political legitimacy at home. When senior Japanese figures spoke publicly on the issue, Beijing interpreted the message as strategic alignment rather than neutrality. The timing only intensified the reaction. China issued formal statements, but it did not wait for extended talks or quiet mediation. Concrete measures followed quickly. Export controls were imposed with deliberately broad language, covering anything that could plausibly fall under military or dual-use classification. That wording is intentional. It casts a wide net that includes advanced technology, industrial components, and even basic materials, while giving regulators maximum discretion. Ambiguity becomes a weapon. When companies cannot clearly define the boundaries, they plan for worst-case disruption. This strategy closely resembles the sanction models popularized by the United States in recent years. Vague definitions, expansive scope, and enforcement pressure shifted onto private companies, rather than governments, have become normalized tools of geopolitical leverage. China is now using the same playbook. Financial markets recognize the signal instantly. Japanese equities dropped over 1% as investors recalculated exposure, not because of a single policy move, but because of what it implied about Japan's standing in an increasingly polarized global order. Beijing's message was unmistakable. Political positioning now carries immediate economic cost, and trade leverage will be used to enforce boundaries. The scale of the restrictions goes far beyond a limited trade dispute. This is a comprehensive export control framework that cuts directly into Japan's supply chains. More than 800 categories of goods are affected, with enforcement taking effect immediately. The targeted sectors are foundational, including chemicals, electronics, precision sensors, industrial machinery, and equipment tied to aerospace and maritime industries. These are not consumer goods that can be swapped with minimal disruption. They are upstream inputs that factories depend on daily. Once deliveries slow or approvals become uncertain, production bottlenecks appear almost overnight. What makes the pressure especially effective is its adaptability. China does not need to publish an exhaustive list. If a product can be argued to have potential military relevance, it can be restricted. That allows pressure to be adjusted selectively, tightening or easing depending on the company, sector, or political context. Even before supply is physically cut off, uncertainty forces Japanese firms to restructure plans, delay investments, and absorb higher risk. As with US-led sanctions regimes, compliance costs, legal exposure, and logistical delays are pushed onto businesses themselves. Over time, those costs accumulate. Contracts are renegotiated, margins compress, and operational efficiency deteriorates. These are not easily replaceable inputs. They underpin industries ranging from automobiles and electronics to heavy manufacturing and advanced technology. When supply reliability disappears, competitiveness declines rapidly. This makes the intent clear. The move is not meant as a temporary signal, but as sustained pressure aimed at the structural foundations of Japan's industrial economy. Once those foundations weaken, the effects ripple outward across employment, pricing, and long-term growth. The depth of vulnerability becomes obvious when trade figures are examined. In 2024, Japan imported roughly $167 billion in goods from China, representing nearly 22.5% of all its imports. That level of reliance is systemic. Nearly $48 billion came from electrical and electronic products, with another $30 billion tied to industrial machinery and materials. These flows support assembly lines, component suppliers, and exporters throughout the country. China's ability to provide large volumes of low-cost, reliable inputs has helped Japanese firms suppress domestic inflation while remaining competitive abroad. If that pipeline becomes unstable, production costs rise quickly, domestic prices follow, export margins shrink, and competitive strength erodes simultaneously on multiple fronts. The imbalance becomes even clearer when dependence is compared on both sides. China's total trade exposure to Japan sits near 5%. Japan's exposure to China is closer to 20%. The leverage is heavily one-sided, and Beijing knows it. What China can absorb as a manageable disruption turns into an immediate strain for Japan, and early warning signs are already visible. Japan's export numbers did improve in November, but the source of that growth matters. The gains came from stronger shipments to the United States and Europe, not from China. In fact, exports to China declined by more than 2%. That drop is easy to overlook in the short term, but it does not fade away. Instead, it quietly builds pressure beneath the surface. This imbalance explains why supply disruptions hit Japan much harder than China. Replacing critical inputs is expensive, slow, and often impractical. When access becomes unreliable, the impact does not show up overnight. It spreads gradually through higher costs, disrupted production timelines, and weakening business confidence, applying steady pressure across the broader economy. The fallout does not remain confined to factories or shipping lanes. It feeds directly into Japan's financial system, where vulnerabilities were already forming. While most G7 central banks have been easing policy, the Bank of Japan has been forced to tighten. Inflation never fully retreated, and as economic growth slows, policymakers find themselves cornered between controlling prices and supporting a weakening economy. The currency reflects this dilemma clearly. Since 2021, the yen has lost roughly a third of its value against the dollar. That slide has continued despite multiple large-scale interventions, including aggressive dollar sales, none of which managed to change the overall direction. A weaker yen raises the cost of imports, intensifying inflationary pressure, especially when supply chains are already under stress. At the same time, rising input costs squeeze companies whose output and demand are already softening. This combination is exactly how stagflation risks begin to emerge. The consequences are now showing up in global comparisons. According to IMF projections, Japan is expected to slip behind India in GDP rankings this year, moving into 5th place worldwide. Currency weakness and sluggish domestic activity are key contributors to that shift. Bond markets are also responding. Japan's public debt exceeds 200% of GDP, a burden that remains sustainable only as long as interest rates stay low. That condition is starting to unravel. The 30-year government bond yield has climbed to a record 3.52%, while the 10-year yield has surpassed 2.1%, its highest level in a quarter century. Investors are demanding higher returns to compensate for inflation risk and currency instability, signaling a decline in long-term confidence. As private demand for government bonds fades, the responsibility increasingly falls on the central bank. Monetizing debt becomes less of a policy option and more of an obligation. Once that cycle takes hold, trade disruptions, currency depreciation, inflation, and bond market stress begin feeding into one another, tightening the pressure around the entire economic system. The most serious escalation risk is hidden in the ambiguous wording of China's export controls. The lack of precise definitions leaves room for rare earth elements to be included. From a regulatory perspective, the argument is simple. Rare earths have military applications, which makes them eligible for restriction. If that threshold is crossed, China's leverage expands dramatically. Japan is particularly vulnerable. Nearly 3/4 of its rare earth imports come from China, and these materials are fundamental, not optional. They are critical to defense systems, electric vehicles, and semiconductor manufacturing, forming the backbone of modern industrial production. Without reliable access, entire industries would slow or shut down, and there is no fast substitute. Alternative suppliers exist in theory, including countries like Vietnam and France, but practical limitations make them insufficient. Available volumes are small, processing capacity is limited, and costs are significantly higher. Even replacing a fraction of China's supply would push prices sharply upward. On a global scale, there simply are not enough rare earth resources to offset China's dominance, particularly as the United States stockpiles supplies for its own strategic priorities. The economic consequences are not hypothetical. Modeling shows that a 3-month interruption in rare earth supplies could result in income losses of roughly $60 billion, about $4.2 billion, reducing national GDP by approximately 0.11%. If disruptions were to last a full year, the situation would likely shift from economic slowdown to outright recession. Competitive pressure is already evident in the electric vehicle market. Chinese firms like BYD are gaining global market share, while Japanese automakers such as Toyota and Honda fall behind. Losing time to supply shortages translates directly into lost ground to competitors. This is why rare earths carry more weight than tariffs or political messaging. Control over these materials allows China to directly constrain Japan's industrial trajectory. At this level of pressure, the room for strategic miscalculation nearly disappears. Japan now faces a narrowing set of options. China has spent years expanding and diversifying its trade relationships across Asia, the Middle East, and the Global South, reducing its own vulnerability and increasing its ability to apply pressure selectively. Japan lacks a similar buffer. This became even clearer when China's Ministry of Commerce launched an anti-dumping investigation into dichlorosilane, a key input in semiconductor manufacturing where Japan holds a leading position. The move is less about immediate supply concerns and more about long-term strategy. Beijing is accelerating efforts to internalize its semiconductor supply chains, and once that transition is complete, Japan's leverage diminishes permanently. What was once interdependence begins to tilt decisively in one direction. Support from abroad offers limited relief. The United States depends on Chinese rare earths for its own defense and industrial needs, restricting how forcefully it can support Japan. Europe, weighed down by weak growth and political fragmentation, lacks the capacity to absorb another major trade shock. Regional dynamics are also shifting, with South Korea rebuilding economic ties with China, while maintaining comparable capabilities in advanced manufacturing and semiconductors. From China's standpoint, alternatives are available. From Japan's perspective, choices are shrinking. Domestic stimulus remains an option, but deploying a massive fiscal package risks stoking inflation further at a time when the yen is already under strain, reducing the effectiveness of such measures. In this environment, economic constraints begin to outweigh political symbolism. The costs of resistance are rising faster than the benefits, and that imbalance is already influencing decision-making. Ultimately, the situation comes down to scale and endurance. China's economy is larger, its industrial base more extensive, and its control over critical inputs tangible. This is not a debate driven by ideology or narratives. It is a matter of numbers. Pressure favors the side that can withstand economic pain for longer. Under these conditions, one question becomes unavoidable. Can Japan realistically sustain this imbalance, or does economic gravity eventually force it to step back?